Hello and welcome. This is Laura O'Brien from the Irish Pagan School, and I'm here today to talk about Irish people's relationship with the Irish language. Now, I don't speak for all Irish people. I don't even think that I'm representative of most Irish people in many ways, in that I am very, very plugged into Irish culture, Irish heritage, the study of the Irish psyche, and observations of our people, past and present. So, most Irish people don't really think as deeply about things maybe as I do, or read as extensively about things as I do, or maybe are aware of the depth and breadth of our mythology, our folklore, as I would be. But of course, many Irish people are, and are far more learned than I am. So just to give you a little bit of context for where I'm at and where I'm coming from, and definitely not claiming to speak for all Irish people. But I do have some thoughts. So the Irish relationship with the Irish language, which we call Gaeilge, by the way, is very complicated. And anytime an Irish person kind of bitches or moans about other Irish people, we tend to kind of get a bit of a weigh in from people a little bit self-righteous outside the culture who are like, why don't Irish people appreciate what they have? Now that could be the language, it could be the stories, it could be whatever, right? And I'm just going to say back the fuck off straight away there. If you are not within the Irish culture, you do not get an opinion on that. With maybe an exception for somebody who has extensively studied, again, our history, our culture, our heritage, probably at a very high academic level, and maybe has formed some hopefully unbiased, more scholarly opinions on things. You have at it, right? But if that's not you, and you're just observing from outside the culture, I guarantee you that you don't understand what's going on here. We've had many people who talk about, again, somewhat self-righteously, and this is not a personal, this happens all the time. So if you're recognizing yourself in this, it's not all about you, right? But this actually happens all the time. I'm coming up 43 years old, and I couldn't even tell you the amount of times that the same conversations, the same observations, the same judgments are being passed, such as, there are more Irish speaking people in a certain geographical area that is not on the island of Ireland, within a certain time people than there were or are, currently in Ireland or at that time period in Ireland. So that kind of comparison is very out of context for, again, if it's a historical period, for probably what was going on in Ireland at the time, between colonisation and plantation, famine, all that kind of stuff. A lot of Irish people would have been driven out of Ireland, so a lot of those Irish speaking people would have been first gen diaspora. So, immigrants, whatever. So, complicated, right? But that's other people's opinions. We're here to talk about the Irish opinion or relationship with our language from my perspective. And there's quite an interesting, not argument, but debate, shall we call it, going on between me and one of our teachers at the Irish Pagan School, Shane Broderick, who I have a huge amount of respect for. But the hill that I'm going to die on, right, is Irish people don't call our language Gaelic, okay? Absolutely bothers me. 100% of the time when somebody refers to the Irish language as Gaelic to me, it is an American, an English person, somebody from outside of Ireland. And I have never in person in my life heard an Irish person refer to our own language as Gaelic, okay? There is a whole Scottish element there, Shane has made the point that it does happen in Gaeltacht regions. On further examination, it would seem that it's mostly an Ulster Irish, which would be a Scots connection again. And again, many people in the Irish Gaeltacht absolutely do not. Even people in, say, the Donegal regions absolutely do not. But it does happen, right? It absolutely does happen in these very sporadic situations, or very particular situations, or very, geographical situations, right? So that's not what most people who refer to the Irish language as Gaelic are doing, or that's not the situation that they're coming from, right? So absolutely do not come at me with Gaelic this or Gaelic that. We call it Irish, or we call it Gaeilge, right? So that's just one like little snippet of how complicated, again, our own relationship with our own language, even between ourselves, is. So we were in college the other day, myself and Amy. We're doing a master's in Irish regional history, and within our cultural history module, we were having a discussion, as we often do in many different modules and on many different topics. We're having a discussion about the Irish language. And at least two people in the class, it's not a big class, there was only maybe 7 or 8 people in the class at that point, because the restrictions for COVID and everything. So it was a very small class, that intake that they took. So there wasn't that many people in the class, and out of those people, 2 were talking about Irish as a dead language. So this is people who are studying. One of them was a school teacher, one of them was a parent, not sure what the occupation is, but both Irish people, both living here in rural Ireland, and again with a very particular view of the Irish language, which isn't actually borne out by the state of the Irish language currently, which is actually experiencing a revival within popular culture, particularly. So moving it out of the realm of the academic. But I would say that actually, those numbers probably, and I mean, I don't know, there were other people who, were in the class who didn't speak up. So I don't know what everybody's, it wasn't a poll or a sample or anything. But, myself and Amy were there, the two of us, like, Irish is not a dead language. And then there were 2 people in the class who were actually, yeah, it is. Like, it's a dying language at least. And I would say that that's probably a fair representation of, like, people who are passionate about Irish and people who just think that it should just, go into a corner and die. And there's a whole lot tied up in that kind of attitude on both sides, actually. Some of it is class-based, particularly people who grew up in maybe the 70s and the 80s in Ireland, even the 90s, when it really was being taught very, very badly. And I mean, the curriculum currently has a lot of improvement still, and we really need to move towards conversational development rather than the quite strict focus, particularly at second level, and the quite strict focus on linguistics, really, on the technical and the structural aspects of it. Now, obviously, that is an important part of learning any language, but I feel that we are kind of letting the side down a little bit by not having the absolute foundation of it, as this is a practical, useful, expressive, conversational subject that you could get some crack out of. Like, some crack is fun and engagement. So there is definitely, the curriculum definitely could do with some improvement still, but it has gotten a huge amount better, like way better than when I was learning in school. And when I was in school, if you didn't have the money for grinds or extra tuition or tutoring, if you didn't, if your parents didn't have the money or the will, really, to send you to the Gaeltacht regions for the summer for the Colostas, the colleges over the summer holidays, where you could kind of be immersed in the language and again develop that kind of practical appreciation for it and engagement with it on a day-to-day level. You were kind of at a loss school-wise, and like going further back into the days of corporal punishment, which was not that long ago. Like, I mean, we're still talking kind of 70s and 80s in Ireland, depending on the area you're with, and again, your economic status. Corporal punishment was definitely a thing even when I was in primary school. So, you start to get the language kind of bed out of you, or any kind of interest or love for the language bed out of you. And none of that is okay, obviously, right? But I think once you scratch the surface of it, then you can go even further back and you can start getting into very, very psychological areas of, post-colonial trauma, the idea of trauma being passed down through DNA, which is a scientific fact, and the concept of the shame and the guilt that were instilled in us over countless generations and hundreds of years. And that's both the savagery, inverted commas, or the lack of civilization that would have been labelled, the Irish language would have been labelled with, or any Irish Gaelic cultures, customs. Gaelic, again, there is the name for the culture, not the language. And just in case people were getting confused, again, we call it Gaeilge or Irish, so please don't do that. So there was this inherent, as I said, like a shame built in. And it got to the point where parents were policing their own children. And it's certainly in a colonized country, it certainly became an economic endeavor to make sure that your children speak English so that they could get jobs, so that they could, Irish became associated with poverty, right? So all of that is still there. It's still like right in the heart of us. It's still in the roots of us. And we will talk about, oh, I've no time for Irish, or I don't like the Irish language, because it gives us a discomfort that is subconscious and we can't name it. And we're mostly, for the vast amount of it, we're not even consciously aware that this pressure is still inside us, this ball of this guilt and shame around speaking our own language. So we do need, as a nation, to kind of start to acknowledge that and to start to become aware of that. I had an experience where myself and John would try and speak Irish, even when we're in the house, but obviously when we're outside, we would try and speak it, even just a couple of words every day. It's important that my kids hear me speaking it. It's important that we practice what we have. Neither of us are fluent. We're both working on it, but it is a process, right? But we were, pre-COVID, we were out in a cafe, and we were sitting down, and the server came over, and as he was coming up to the table, we were having a conversation as Gaeilge in Irish. And it's a little bit stilted, and it's a little bit, kind of, there's a couple of loan words thrown in Imerla in English, because we can't kind of figure out, we haven't got the vocabulary, right? So that's all kind of going on, and we're kind of focusing on that. And he kind of came on us without us really realizing that he was there. So suddenly there was another person who was witnessing us speaking Irish, and I had this, like, my whole head got red. I had this indraw, actually felt it, physically felt it, and I was like, what the fuck was that? I was ashamed that somebody had heard me and John speak Irish. And I was like, whose reaction was that? Because that's not me. That's not the feelings that I thought I had about Irish. So I don't know what ancestor that was coming from, or what line that was being passed down, but it was there, and it was physical, and it was visceral. And, I would do a lot of work with shadow work and my own subconscious through journeying. If you want to know more about that, comment below and I'll see if I can put together a video on those topics. But because of that awareness and because of that consistent work and practice and discipline on those topics, I became consciously aware of what was going on. But like that physical reaction could have been very quickly suppressed and subsumed and internalized into something completely different of like, maybe projection. Oh, he was laughing at us for speaking Irish, or he thought that we were stupid, or he thought that we were the other side of things, which is like, again, we moved from this like the Irish language and people who speak Irish are stupid, they're poor, they're, economically deficient, they're all of those things, right? We moved from that then into the Gaelic revival, again, cultural, not linguistic terminology, but the Celtic revival, even as it was called in some quarters, the late 1800s and early 1900s, which got very tied up in our revolution, in our civil war, in the establishment of our state, and all of this. But that became very much an ascendancy thing, or an upper class kind of thing, with the antiquarians in the 1800s, and then subsequently then through much of the revolutionary movement was actually the upper class, in Ireland. Not all of it, obviously, but a lot of it. And, people who had the means, the time, their basic survival needs being met, actually, had the time to sit around and plan revolutions, right? Who knew? Your government is keeping you poor on purpose and keeping you uneducated on purpose, just as an aside. History absolutely attests to this. So anyway, the Irish language then became associated through the 1900s, and certainly in the 1980s, 1990s, 1970s, 80s, 90s. The posh people, the well-off people, were the ones who could afford to send their kids to the Gaeltacht regions, which are the Irish language regions, which still speak Irish as a primary language on the island. They are shrinking, but they still exist, and they obviously did exist back then as well. And actually, there are more people. They are shrinking, they are dying, blah, blah, blah. Listen to me. There is actually, again, a revival of interest now that a lot more people can work remotely and work from home. There are younger people moving back in, because a lot of the migration out of Gaeltacht regions would have been economic, because they are rural, and people would have been moving, young people would have been moving from Gaeltacht regions into cities or outside the country altogether, for jobs, So now that some of that economic pressure has been removed out of situations, there is more of an interest in people coming back in and staying in the Gaeltacht and moving back into the Gaeltacht. So that is a trend that we're starting to see. And I mean, that would have been relevant for any rural community in Ireland. That I genuinely don't think that people were moving out of the Gaeltacht because it was a Gaeltacht region. I actually think probably if you examined it, not sure if this research has been done, but you would have seen people who were in Gaeltacht regions a little bit more attached and maybe staying a little bit longer, holding out for as long as they could before having to move for economic reasons, or social reasons in some cases. But I think primarily, it would have been that rural to urban migration would have been the patterns that we've been seeing in previous decades. So that is changing now. And, I guess thanks pandemic, a lot of people would have been forced to work from home. And again, we are seeing this uptick in interest and in location back into Gaeltacht regions. It's minimal, but it's happening, right? So all of that being said, I suppose, I think I maybe had a point that I trailed off on, apologies for that, but all of that being said, the Irish relationship with the Irish language is complicated, okay? And it's okay if you're an Irish person, it's okay to not know how you feel about Irish. It's okay to explore. I'm going to put a great link in the comments below um, about a newspaper article about different bits and pieces that are happening, and there's some resources in it, and it just gives a little bit more of an optimistic maybe view of the Irish language than a lot of Irish people would be familiar with, or would be it will maybe help you to address some of the ingrained kind of assumptions or ideas that you have, or that you thought you had about the Irish language, about the state, the current state of the Irish language. I don't mean like the state of it, I mean the actual state that it's in. That's an Irish colloquialism, like state something is like a negative thing, but that's not what I mean. Even our English is Hiberno English, which is interesting, and is very much a cultural thing. So hopefully that's been interesting to you. And again, if you're outside of Ireland and observing any of this, I hope that this gives you a slightly better understanding of where maybe Irish people are coming from, and take your judgy pants off, and just understand that, obviously even what I've outlined here is only skimming the surface of it, right? So judge your pants off, you don't get to comment, and this is just where we're at right now. So if you like any of this, we actually have on the Irish Pagan School, we have an excellent introduction to the Irish language course. So I'll put a link to that down below as well. And Irish is very free-flowing through much of our material and through many of our courses. So you'll pick up little bits and pieces, but also you'll pick up an appreciation for the Irish language, and a graw love or passion for it is communicated with many or even most of our teachers who are all Irish. So hopefully that's been useful, and slán go fóill, and I will see you in the next video.